Hello.
Hello, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So I plugged in my earbud. I could hear you just fine, but I'm still at work and I'm actually working with some other people. So I
Oh,
can see the screen and I can hear you. So just go ahead and get started, and I'll be listening in, but I won't be able to talk or respond for probably till the end of the meeting.
okay. All right, that should work.
All right.
Okay. I think I'm just going to sit back here with you. I can control it from here. So the way this usually works, I have an agenda, but it doesn't really mean anything. Like the times, I just use it to kind of organize the slides. So, but basically, the point of this particular presentation is talking about some of the philosophical history and theories around the nature of reality, like what we see around us. So we're going to talk about first a little bit of stuff in relation to a previous talk that we had that was about mysticism, basically the traditions that exist in pretty much all religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism as well. So we already talked about that in a previous time, but I'm just going to show kind of a relationship between the philosophy that we talked about today and some of those previous topics. And then I really enjoyed the film The Matrix. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not. It was a film about this guy who was living in this computer simulation, and then he met with some guys who managed to pull him out of it, and it turned out that the machines had taken over the world, and they put everybody in this computer simulation. Came out in like 1999. Fun movie, but anyway, it doesn't matter too much because what we move on to then is the actual simulation theory, which is a theory that's much broader than that, and I'll cover that a little bit, and then we'll talk about the allegory of Plato's Cave, which is a classic Greek allegory that's very interesting from the philosophical point of view. And then the problem of universals is essentially attached to that. And then I'll show a video, which is a TED talk on an interesting theory called interface theory. And we can listen to Dr. Hoffman is going to be the speaker for that part. All right, so that's just kind of an overview of what we'll talk about. All right, so this is very similar, or it's basically going to be a reference back to what we talked about previously. As we discussed, basically mysticism historically in Judaism and Islam and Christianity, the goal is to elevate one's awareness to some sort of higher concept of reality, basically to get a better understanding of God or the universe or whatever the particular religion happens to believe in. It's a search for like an ultimate truth or a true nature of reality beyond what we necessarily see around us. Okay, and so the matrix actually exemplifies that search. And so basically I divided it into kind of like steps or basically different phases, because there's a pattern that if you look at different mystic traditions, they all kind of follow this same sort of pattern. Basically, the root of the concept comes from just mystery. So it's really like I was very ignorant when I first started studying this. I associated the word mysticism with things like communicating with spirits, things like that I'm not interested in. Yeah, I was very skeptical about it when I first started studying. And then I learned mysticism is just more focused on kind of experiential communion with God or a supernatural, basically trying to get closer to that kind of connection. If you look at monks and monastic traditions living off in the wilderness or in monasteries and so forth, they're all practicing a form of mysticism because they're trying. Hmm? Or nuns? Yes, exactly. They're trying to basically communicate or get a better understanding of God, essentially. So that's really what mysticism is. And, like I say, I was very confused when I started. So it's very clarifying for me to learn about this. So basically, the pattern that we see most of the time, and over here you'll see little scenes from the movie, but it doesn't matter if you didn't watch it, is living a normal life. Basically, you see this is just the world around us, and there's nothing supernatural, there's nothing special about the world. That's what people might think initially. And then they learn the truth, usually through some sort of spiritual teacher, some sort of learning that they gather. Like in Judaism, it's from Kabbalah, if you're familiar with that term. They have a study called Kabbalah that's like an advanced study of the Torah, the original Old Testament scriptures. And that study is what basically takes them through the next levels that they try to achieve through their tradition, through the Jewish tradition. And then the next step is usually seeing the larger picture, seeing reality for what it really is, seeing that there might be unseen elements to our reality, and seeing that God represents a larger force than what we see in the physical world. Then next would be discovering your purpose. Like, is it your purpose to, I don't know, be some sort of leader, or is your purpose to just learn more about God, or what is your purpose in the overall scheme of things? And then spiritual practices and disciplines such as meditation, prayer, and those sort of things. And then eventually, some traditions would call it enlightenment, or just living with the truth of the fullness of reality, understanding what the true nature of reality is and living with that truth. And so that has a really good tie into Matrix. All right. So the big question, what is reality, right? So there's a lot of interesting theories about this. And one of the particularly interesting ones is a thought experiment that goes back, well, it actually goes back really far, because if you look at my next bullet point, brain in a vat is a philosophical premise, a modern premise, but really it's just a modern variation of a thought experiment that Rene Descartes came up with called the evil demon thought experiment. And basically what Descartes came up with was basically saying, let's suppose that there's this evil demon that controls me, and he deceives me into believing that everything around me is what I see. And how would I know the difference if someone was controlling my brain to make me see all these things? So basically, the brain in a vat is a modern version of that, where they say, okay, well, if your brain were simply external from your body and sitting in a vat, and a computer was hooked up via electrodes to your brain and telling your brain all of these things that you would normally experience through your external senses, how would you actually tell the difference? It's just a thought experiment that philosophers have come up with. But it is interesting because, of course, the matrix that we were just looking at actually is based on that premise. So basically, like I said, they're all hooked into a computer simulation and they can't tell the difference. So they think that the computer simulation is real, and they have no way of knowing the difference until someone comes along and tries to help them come out of it. I'm attending a seekers meeting right now, for example. You could think that it's real, but it's not. Okay, so simulation theory. So this is an elaboration of some of those thoughts. This is one of the theories that's out there in philosophy today. Basically, it goes like this. It says, okay, well, we already have the technology to make simulated worlds on computers, like computer games and things like that. We can already do that today. The theory says that in the future, these simulated worlds would become indistinguishable from the real world. We have things like incredibly realistic graphics. We have 3D immersion. We have virtual reality, which is becoming really big right now, really popular. And haptic feedback basically is like, right now, it's usually gloves or controllers that you hold in your hands, so that when you interact with something that you see in a virtual world, then it actually provides some sort of feedback to where you feel whatever it is that you're touching, or whatever it is that you see in the world. And as those technologies continue to advance, the theory says, eventually you won't be able to tell the difference between what I would see around me right now and if I was in a virtual world interacting with different objects, but I would think it's just as real as this. And so the theory goes on to say that with unlimited time, it would stand to reason that some civilization, not necessarily ours. So basically, this is, for example, this is the kind of graphics that they can produce right now in computer games. I mean, I can't tell that that's not a beach. I can't tell that that's produced by a computer. But that picture is produced by a computer. It's completely fake. But the idea is that as that continues on and continues on, it's just going to get better and better to where eventually you won't be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's in a computer. Yeah, exactly. And so then, of course, the theory goes on to say, but that's just what the theory says.
When we see that, this is a robot, not a human being.
That right there is a robot, yes. But it looks like a real robot. I mean, it's very real looking at. But what really impressed me was the tiny little rocks on the beach. It looks so real. I was amazed by the graphics.
All of this is made by the computer.
Yeah, that's all fake. That's a computer game.
How did they make it?
I have no idea. But Joe does, because he makes those.
Oh, he makes those.
He makes video games. Yep.
Wow.
But still, he works with computer graphics, so he would be able to answer that better than I can. I'm always amazed by that kind of stuff. Okay, so basically Plato from ancient Greece came up with this little story that he would tell called the Allegory of Plato's Cave. And it's from a book that he wrote called The Republic in about 380 BC. And basically, here's what he describes. And I'm going to go up here and illustrate from the picture just to kind of point out the different areas. So basically, he says, let's imagine that there's a group of prisoners that have lived their entire life in a cave, okay? And they're chained to the wall of the cave. They can't move. They can't even look at each other. They can't see, here's a prisoner and here's another prisoner. They have to look straight ahead. And all they can see is a wall in front of them. And they see on the wall, they see these shadows that are being produced because behind them, there's a fire, right? And then there's different people walking in front of the fire, and they're carrying like cutouts or wooden versions of different things, like cows or horses or even buildings or trees. Basically, it's all fake. They're carrying just like puppets, right? And so the shadows of the puppets are being projected on the wall. And so the prisoners, for their entire life, all they see is those shadows. That's all they know. And they have names for them. They see the shadow that looks like a tree, and they say, oh, that's a tree. And they see the shadow that looks like a man, and they say, oh, that's a man. And that's the only reality they know. And so at some point, one of the prisoners gets a little bit curious, and he decides, oh, I want to find out what's beyond these chains that I can see. So he finally somehow escapes. He gets out of the chains, and he goes up this little walkway here, and he sees, oh my gosh, there's all these guys. They're carrying these weird things in front of this fire that I don't understand. And what are all these cardboard cutouts or puppets? That is so much more real than the shadows I've been looking at my entire life. And so then he even goes further, and he walks beyond the fire, and he goes all the way back up and out of the cave entirely. And now he's out here, and he's seeing the actual trees and the actual animals and the actual sunlight. And he's saying, well, that's even more real than the objects I was seeing here, which were, of course, more real than the shadows I was seeing in front. Now, when he first gets out of the cave, though, his eyes are so adjusted to the dark that he can't see anything. The sunlight blinds him at first, right? And so he has to wait for his eyes to adjust, and then he sees this amazing reality around him that he had no concept of before that. So he's so amazed that he wants to go back and tell
someone blind when he was at the cave.
Exactly. And so he gets so excited about it that he wants to go back and tell his friends, right? The prisoners that are still locked up in the cave. Unfortunately, when he goes back into the cave, of course, now that his eyes have adjusted to the light, he goes back into the cave and he can't see a thing. And he goes to the guys and he's like, you will never believe what I found out. I found out that there's this amazing reality that produces these shadows, and there's this amazing outside that you've never even heard of. And all the guys, all the other prisoners, they don't believe him because they're like, we only know these shadows. What are you talking about? And he's saying, can you even see right now? And the guy's like, I can't even see right now because my eyes are, he's back in the dark, right? And so the other prisoners, they think, well, whatever you did, it's messed you up because now you can't even see anyone. So the whole story was basically, Plato was describing that he believed, his philosophy was that there is a greater reality beyond the physical world that we see around us. That was his way of describing that, was this allegory. And so basically he described the three levels of reality, which we just talked about. There's the shadows, and then of course he discovered there was actually puppets producing the shadows, and then he found out that there was an outside above all of that. And they believed that the experience was harmful because he was now blind. So the problem with universals is basically another philosophy that Plato was dealing with. Basically, it's related to what we just talked about. Universal is a philosophical term that's used to explain similarities between objects. So it's like when they say Granny Smith apples are green and grass is also green. Basically, what Plato was saying was that there's this concept of green that exists irrespective of Granny Smith apples or grass. There's this green concept, right? So basically what he described was called realism, or specifically Platonic realism. And he insisted that the universals, those concepts that describe similarities between physical objects, are completely separate entities, and they exist in a non-physical realm of abstract forms that's completely separate from the physical universe. His pupil, Aristotle, actually broke with that, and he said, no, I think that my mentor is completely crazy. And he says that while the universals, he believes, are indeed separate from the items that share them, he says that they only exist when there are particular objects that exhibit them. Basically, he's saying that if there was nothing green in the world, that then green wouldn't exist. There is no concept of green independent of the things that are green. That's what Aristotle tried to say. And then another approach was called nominalism. Basically, it was saying that the attributes that we ascribe to objects like green is just part of the name that we're giving the object. We made up the word green and we're saying that that thing is green, but that doesn't mean that there's some mystical green universal out there that's shared between these objects. That's just nonsense in our heads, is what nominalism states. And interestingly, a gentleman by the name of William of Ockham, which is where we get the expression Occam's razor, which means that usually the simplest explanation is the right one. The explanation that requires the least assumptions is typically the correct explanation. He was one of the pioneers of this nominalism, which basically just does away with Plato's idea of having this separate realm of forms. And then the last one is called idealism. This basically emerged from the ideas of people like Plotinus, which was a Neoplatonic thinker, philosopher, in the early first couple of centuries. And then Augustine, which was actually one of the original Christian leaders, Augustine. And they argued that universals exist in the mind of God, and that is what presaged conceptualism. So conceptualism says that the attributes that we call universals, such as like beauty, for example, or green, they're concepts that are created by the mind. And so they only exist in the descriptions of these things that share beauty or green or whatever. And they say that the mind that's coming up with all of that stuff is actually God's mind. And that's where all of these universal attributes come from. That's pretty much everything I had up to the point where I go into the video. So after this, it's like another 15 minutes or so of the video. The next topic for May is basically what I did was I divided this idea of what is reality. I divided it into philosophy and physics. So this was all about imagining what reality could be from a philosophical standpoint. But then the next time, which actually I think I'm going to enjoy a little bit more, is talking more about physics. It gets into quantum physics and what reality is actually made of at the very minute scale.